The topic that I have been asked to address this afternoon is whether or not America still has a future. I will keep my remarks brief. No, thank you. No, my remarks will not be that brief. But the answer to the question does in fact hinge on that powerful, beautiful, two-letter word, no. I love that. It's a wonderful little word. It is a word that conservatives once embraced, but in recent decades have come to neglect. Just say no. Nancy Reagan told us, and we forgot. Conservatives used to embrace limits in politics. No longer. Now we're all about liberty, or some pale imitation of liberty, I should say. Now we're the party of doing whatever you want, whatever you think you want, just as so long as we don't have to pay for it. We used to impose limits at the border, for illegal aliens, sure, but for legal aliens to some degree as well. We demanded criminal justice rather than first steps for inmates who have not yet paid their debt to society. We contained the power of corporations, whom we viewed not merely as saintly job creators, but as a powerful interest in society that can trample our rights and way of life just as surely as the government can. We imposed limits on our personal appetites, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. We even supported limits on that now sacred idol of the American right, free speech. We ostracized and persecuted people for things that they said: obscenity, sedition, threats, slander, fighting words, even blasphemy, a criminal offense throughout large swaths of the United States well into the 20th century. We did not merely exercise our personal or cultural influence to enforce these limits on speech and behavior. We wielded the government. But in recent years, many self-styled conservatives have come to consider these measures that would limit individual autonomy, even the autonomy of foreigners, even the autonomy of criminals, anathema. Such limits are considered authoritarian or illiberal. So conservatives have become the party of yes. In the face of leftist radicalism, the right in recent years has said yes, albeit with a few impotent caveats. Yes to limitless immigration, just so long as at least some of it is legal. Not all of it, but some of it. Yes to outsourcing. Yes to drug legalization. Yes to the radical redefinition of the family, the fundamental building block of society, the fundamental political institution. Yes to redefining sex itself. Sure, conservatives might still oppose some of those things on a personal level, but the right has all too often insisted that the government has no role in stopping any of them. Politics, after all, we are told, is downstream of culture. We just need to fight harder to win the hearts and minds in the value-neutral free marketplace of ideas, we are told. Today's conservatives, we are told, are the real liberals. Perhaps that is the problem. But it is worth remembering, by the way, that virtually nothing that the liberals and the squishes have told us is true. About history, about philosophy, about politics, and none of it. Throughout American history, the government has had a role in all of those issues. Politics may, in a sense, be downstream of culture, but politics, whatever we really mean by that, influences culture as well. Today, West Germany is relatively religious. East Germany is atheist, not because of cultural variations in bratwurst throughout the country, but I suspect because of the godless communist regime that dominated East Germany for 40 years. Probably had more to do with it than culture. It had a cultural effect. The supposedly free marketplace of ideas has never been value neutral. And if the squishes ever took the time to read the actual classical liberals, they would probably call them fascists. John Locke, I think still a liberal in good standing, the father of liberalism, in his letter concerning toleration, argued for ostracizing atheists. Quote, "Those are not at all to be tolerated who deny the being of a God," explained John Locke. John Milton wrote the most famous defense of free speech in the English language, Areopagitica. Well, in that work, he called for the censorship of Catholics. Frankly, though I am a mackerel-snapping papist myself, I get it, okay? I can sympathize with the desire to settle certain questions amid the religious conflict that, at the time, threatened England's very existence. By modern standards, our liberal founding fathers were pretty authoritarian themselves. In 1777, do you know what the punishment for sodomy was in Virginia? Death. Seems a little harsh to me, but it was death. The broad-minded liberal Thomas Jefferson suggested a reform of this punishment. He suggested it be punished with mere castration. Pretty harsh, too. Very liberal of him, I guess, but I don't know. And by the way, that proposal was shut down. They said, sorry, that's too lenient. We can't have that. In 1798, our nation's second president, John Adams, passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which, among other things, made it more difficult for immigrants to become citizens, allowed the president to deport non-citizens whom he considered dangerous, and criminalized making false statements about the federal government. Parts of those laws remain on the books to this very day. They may not be enforced, but they are on the books. In the 1940s and 50s, more than 200 communists, anarchists, and fascists were prosecuted in the United States under the Smith Act. That same decade, William F. Buckley Jr. launched the post-war conservative movement with his book God and Man at Yale, subtitle, The Superstitions of Academic Freedom. Academic freedom was a liberal concept that Buckley mocked as a, quote, hoax. In his next book, Buckley defended Joe McCarthy. Here's what he said about McCarthyism. McCarthyism is a movement around which men of goodwill and stern morality can close ranks. Hear, hear. It is astounding that so many of today's most prominent squishes on the right cite William F. Buckley Jr. as the inspiration for their crusade to abjure all social standards. Have they read the man? Have they ever Googled him, perhaps? In a debate with Leo Chern in 1966 on the future of McCarthyism, it's scandalous for a lot of people that McCarthyism might even have a future, Bill Buckley mocked his guest's exaltation of the open society. Chern said, Bill, surely you and I both agree we want an open society. It's essential to all that we both want. Buckley said, I won't do my Bill Buckley impression. You wouldn't understand me if I did. He said, I don't want the society to be open to certain ideas. I am an epistemological optimist. What a Buckley-esque phrase, an epistemological optimist. That is the unfortunate word they use to describe people who believe that by reason you can make certain exclusions, and those exclusions don't have to be reconsidered. Not to put too fine a point on it, Buckley concluded, I don't feel any obligation to protect the liberties of a Nazi or of a communist. I, for one, am with Buckley. I, for one, am an epistemological optimist. I believe we can, in fact, know things. We can make certain exclusions that do not have to be reconsidered. And we should make those exclusions. And more importantly, we must. It is inevitable. All societies have limits, laws, standards, mores, taboos. Those limits delineate a society's vision of what is good and true and beautiful. Beyond those limits lies what society considers to be bad and false and ugly. There is no such thing as a perfectly neutral public square. Tuck that away with the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy. It does not exist. The public square itself has limits, and someone or some group of people will set those limits. The free speech movement at Berkeley did not lead to some Edenic era of free expression. It led to cancel culture. It led to a society with limits every bit as rigid as the one it replaced. All cultures cancel. One was canceled in the 1950s for being a communist. One is canceled today for not being a communist. One gets canceled. Today, wokeness demands and prohibits certain behaviors of and from us. In more civilized times, that same function would have been performed by chivalry. The substantive views of our society have changed. The basic character and functions of all societies have not. So where does that leave us? Actually, I think it leaves us in a pretty good position. The political convulsions on the right since Donald Trump cremated the dead consensus have left various factions on the right vying for position. The nationalists, the integralists, the populists, the paleos, the Claremonsters, the list goes on and on. We could stay here listing them all day. I have been told by a friend of mine that obscure political monikers are the right-wing version of gender pronouns. You know. I love listening to all of these intense, sometimes bitter debates, but I think we may be getting a little ahead of ourselves. We are living in a time when the right remains divided over whether or not to outlaw drag queen story hour. Often the debates on the right revolve around ultimate ends. Sure, we may agree on what is to be done in the short and intermediate term, but what will we do in the end, once we have reestablished a healthy, coherent American nation? How precisely will we justify our claims to authority? How will this rebuilt, strong, unified American nation project its power? Should it project that power at all? Should it transcend the nation? It is like arguing with your high school garage band over who will one day get to keep the Grammy. It is like Orville and Wilbur Wright fighting over who will get to take the first step onto Mars. The right cannot agree to ban perverts from twerking for toddlers in the library. We have a long way to go before we will need to decide whether or not to resurrect the Holy Roman Empire. Our ultimate ends may differ. Our intermediate goals are almost identical. We all want a healthy and distinct American nation, whether as an end unto itself or as the best instrument available for opposing hegemonic liberalism. We all want an escape from the suicidal subjectivism that has infected both the left and the right, at least since the 1960s and probably much further back than that. We all want to move beyond petty defenses of procedural norms to the more fruitful embrace of substantive goods. Skepticism, to borrow another line from Buckley, has utility only when it leads to conviction. So what are those substantive goods? A common critique of the new right is that we know what we don't like, but we can't quite say what we want. We can say no, but not much of anything else. In fact, I think the opposite is true. I think broadly we agree on many of those substantive goods. We have an implicit inkling as to their character thanks to our reason and moral conscience. We have a record of their place in public life thanks to our history and philosophy and theology, and we have at least the memory of them still in our bones. With a greater degree of accuracy than many today will admit, we actually can know right from wrong, and we do. And, most importantly, if we are to recover something even vaguely reminiscent of American self-government, we must. It is inevitable. What we do not have to a sufficient degree as of yet is courage and the confidence to enforce this vision of the good. The willingness to tell people, no. No, you may not desecrate our national symbols. No, you may not redefine the most fundamental elements of society. No, you may not do whatever you please, no matter how destructive, to or with your body. No, you may not shirk, in the words of Edmund Burke, that generous loyalty to rank and sex, that proud submission, that dignified obedience, that subordination of the heart which kept alive, even in servitude itself, the spirit of an exalted freedom. The parents presently storming their school boards understand the importance of that word, no. They understand that liberty without limits is not liberty at all, but licentiousness, which is to say slavery. And they have the courage to enforce those limits with what little political power they have. We must do the same, and we must do it now. If Americans are to have a future as a free people, we will do so as a nation with limits. A nation without limits is no nation at all. Just as the destruction of traditional standards has made our country coarser, weaker, and more vicious with each passing year, so too the reinforcement of just standards gradually perhaps at first, then more confidently, will make our nation better, stronger, and more pleasant to live in with each passing year. Virtue is a habit. The present political focus on education can teach us quite a lot about how to make America great again. Education is supposed to make us free. That is why we refer to liberal education. That's why we study the liberal arts. Education is supposed to tame our base appetites, our lower will, and subordinate it to our higher rational will, which mediates between the appetite and the divine will. Our education is supposed to order our will and intellect toward the true good. Paradoxically, education is a coercive act. Our teachers force us to learn the right answer. Ultimately, they prod and nudge and force us to be free. Usually just with bad grades. If you went to Catholic school, maybe the nuns gave you a little thwack on the knuckles. Unlike the American right, the left has not forgotten these most basic aspects of education and statecraft. For decades, they have miseducated our nation into delusion and destruction. Open borders, toppled statues, political violence, sexual anarchy, and on and on and on. After so long a stream of laissez-faire babble about the wizardry of the invisible hand, many conservatives might recoil at the seemingly heavy-handed policies that are required to correct these decades of decadence. Like addicts who have lost control of their will, who have abused their liberty to licentiousness, they may persist in delusion or denial. For the rest of us, though, the next step toward national recovery is clear enough. Just say no. Thank you very much. Thank you.